Places where these ticks are at very high density, some of the places in the northeast United States, they have moose that die from exsanguination, just from losing blood. And even if they don't drink them dry, they wind up causing a pretty high energetic cost because moose are constantly replacing this blood. They also, if they have these high infestations, wind up rubbing and scratching and breaking off their guard hairs so that they have less insulation in the winter, which means they burn more energy staying warm.
Hello, and welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. I am your host for the day, Danae Lenz, External Communications Coordinator for U of I. As always, I am joined by my co-host. Hi, Lee.
Hey, Danae. My name's Lee Cooper, and I'm an editor and science writer here at the university.
Today we're going to talk about animals, and more specifically, mammals. I know we usually start off with a question, but I don't have a question for you. I have a request.
Okay.
I need you to Google moose ticks.
This seems bad already. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, why? Why? Oh my God, there's so many.
Can you describe it for us?
Oh my God. Yes. Sort of. I'm sorry, listeners. It looks like a entire pile. Like, I can't see the skin. It's just rows and rows and rows of ticks. There's one that has a full, like a ruler, a foot ruler, and every single bit of the ruler is surrounded by ticks. It's a foot of ticks.
Oh.
And all the little moose have their hair falling out. They're all bald.
That sucks.
That was a joy, Danae. Thanks for making me do that.
It's because I love you, Lee. I just subject you to the kindest things. Today we're going to get a little bit of insight into why there are so many ticks on moose. Today we're going to talk to Janet Rachlow. She is a professor of wildlife ecology in the College of Natural Resources at University of Idaho. She has studied mammals, both large and small, and today she's going to talk to us about two of them at both ends of the size scale. Are you ready to get into it?
After those pictures, I don't know.
At least you'll know the answers.
All right, I'm in.
Hi, Janet. Welcome to the Vandal Theory.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to chat with you today. To start us off, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. I'm a faculty in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Sciences, and our research focuses on mammals, their ecology, and especially their relationships with the environment and how we can use that information to help with conservation and management.
So you have researched animals both big and small, and today we are going to get into two that are on both ends of that spectrum. But let's start small with pygmy rabbits.
Yes.
How did you get into that?
Yeah. So, I started here about 20 years ago, and I came from another area, and I was really interested in doing research, starting research that was useful for management and conservation for wildlife in this region. And in talking with some biologists at the Bureau of Land Management, they suggested I look into pygmy rabbits. And a lot of work has been done in the sagebrush steppe with sage grouse, but less work has been done with mammals in the sagebrush steppe. And pygmy rabbits are pretty unique in that they occur only in sagebrush steppe environments. So they're sort of the mammalian equivalent of a sage grouse. And, 20 years ago, there was relatively little information about the details of their ecology. So we started asking some questions, and as we asked questions, we just found more questions that were interesting to address.
What were some of those questions, and what did you find when you were trying to answer them?
Okay, so pygmy rabbits occur only in sagebrush steppe habitats, but we didn't really know their distribution. And so we were interested, first of all, in knowing where they occur, how many places they occur, and then understanding, what is good habitat for these animals. They're a little bit unique in that they're burrowing. So unlike other rabbits in North America, they are considered obligate burrowers. So they dig burrows and they use them year round. They're also pretty unique in that they forage on sagebrush. And, if you've been out in the sagebrush environment, it smells great. It has a very strong smell. And that is because the plants, sagebrush, are producing chemicals that are meant to stop animals from eating it. And yet pygmy rabbits and sage grouse can, for at least part of the year, eat almost entirely sagebrush, which is super toxic. It'd be really toxic for you and me.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. So anyway, we were interested in just understanding, what is their habitat? Where are they? What do we know about how their numbers might have changed over time? And about 20 years ago, there was a petition for listing the species as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And when that occurs, there was a call for much more information. So we started to do more studies about space use and habitat use and survival and reproduction. And that really helped us gain a better understanding of the ecology of this pretty unique little animal. I should say also they are pygmies. They earn their name. They max out at about a pound. So they're, really small rabbits.
Going back to them eating sagebrush, do you know what's going on in their bodies that makes it so that they can digest this toxic stuff?
Yeah, and actually this has been work that through a couple of collaborators, Lisa Shipley at Washington State University and Jen Forby at Boise State University, we've worked together, and they both are foraging and chemical ecologist specialists. And some of the work that they've done has demonstrated that pygmy rabbits will voluntarily eat toxic plants more than, for example, cottontails, which live in the same environment, but they are better at detoxifying it in the liver. They're better at excreting it, so they're minimizing their exposure to these toxins in part by moving these toxins through their bodies and excreting them. Pygmy rabbits, like a lot of other mammals, also probably are able to deal with some of that right up front in their mouth. Many mammals have saliva that can essentially grab onto some of those toxins and move it through the body so that it moves out and is excreted, and the animal's tissues are not exposed to it. So pygmy rabbits probably use a variety of those mechanisms, but they also choose among sagebrush plants in ways that they can minimize their exposure. So we had a study many years ago, had a graduate student that compared sagebrush that were browsed and unbrowsed in the field, and they looked the same to you and me. But when she tested the makeup of those plants that were browsed had higher levels of protein and lower levels of some of these toxic chemicals. And interestingly, when we brought those same plants into the lab and fed those to captive rabbits, they made the exact same choices that the animals in the field make. So sagebrush that looks really the same to you and me is really not to them.
You've also done some research related to these pygmy rabbits regarding the trade-offs they make when choosing a habitat. What are some of those trade-offs, and also what is a pygmy rabbit's favorite habitat?
Yeah, great question. Well, this again comes back to some trying to understand what is quality habitat. We really have to do that from the animal's perspective. And a lot of us, me included, you drive through a sagebrush environment and it all looks the same, but it's not from their perspective. And so we've tried to measure what we call functional habitat components. So not just measuring how much plant is there or how big is it, but measuring the properties of that plant that might be important to survival and reproduction. So for example, pygmy rabbits are unfortunate to be at the bottom of the food chain. Everything eats them. And a lot of their life is spent trying not to be eaten. So they can do that in some ways. They can hide, so they can be in areas where the vegetation really conceals them. But for a lot of small animals that are prey animals, sometimes it's really good to be able to see the predators coming so you can take the appropriate evasive action. So we've tried to measure those different functional properties. How well is an animal concealed? How well does it provide sight lines or visibility where an animal can see predators? In collaboration with Dr. Forby and Dr. Shipley, we've asked some questions about the plants and the forage quality in terms of protein, in terms of the amount of energy in the plants, and also the amount of or the relative types of those toxins. We've also looked at the thermal environment. Pygmy rabbits are small-bodied, so they're a little bit more vulnerable to super cold temperatures because they have a large surface to volume ratio. Rabbits in general don't have very good mechanisms for brain cooling, so they're also pretty susceptible to hot temperatures. So when we've looked at trade-offs, we've tried to measure what they use or what they choose to use in terms of the thermal properties, the forage properties, the security or predator escape properties. So we've looked at those trade-offs are trading off very different parts of the habitat, very different components. If you ask me what's a favorite habitat, if I were a pygmy rabbit, I would want to be in a place where there's lots of good food that's relatively low in the toxins, but high in the energy and the protein. And you'd want to be in a place where you could hide really well, a place that's close to your burrow, a place that has soil texture that allows burrows to remain intact. So not too sandy, so burrows aren't collapsing, but not too hard, not too rocky, so they can't dig through it. They seem to choose vegetation structure that's a little patchy. And patchiness probably gives them the best of both worlds when it comes to both hiding and being able to have sight lines out where you can see predators coming.
Where do you find these pygmy rabbits? Are they an Idaho thing, a Northwestern thing, or are they kind of across the country?
Yeah, no, great question. So they occur only in the western United States, and they occur in the Great Basin and then also in Washington in the Columbia Basin, which is separated by quite a distance from the Great Basin. But that's a pretty broad area, but they have a very patchy distribution within that broad area. And that's one of the things that we want to understand is what is it that makes some patches suitable and other patches not? And so in Idaho here, they occur in the southern part of Idaho. So they occur south of the Snake River Plain and across a lot of that area, and then north of the Snake River Plain in southeast Idaho and on up into those valleys that border Montana, so the Lemhi, the Big Lost, Little Lost Valley, but in southern Idaho. Yeah, I wish they were up here, but they aren't.
You've recently received more funding to continue studying these rabbits. What new questions will you be trying to answer?
The project we're just starting now, and I'm super excited about it. We have 3 PhD students that are all going to be working together on it and a whole bunch of different faculty. And then it builds on some work that one of my previous students did where she modeled the distribution of the species in Idaho and a little bit outside of Idaho, and then asked what features of the environment are correlated with where those animals persist now. And many of the important parameters that we're predicting where they occur are environmental parameters, what we call bioclimatic, dealing with temperature and precipitation. So just for fun, we took those bioclimatic variables and we projected them forward under some of the climate projections. And we asked, where will suitable habitat for these animals be in the future based on what we know now? And not surprisingly, that habitat really shifted around and much of it disappeared. That's interesting. There's lots of reasons why that's probably not very accurate, because animals have what we think of it under the umbrella of adaptive capacity. That's their ability to deal with change. And they can deal with that by evolving. There's evolution occurring all the time. They can do that by altering their behavior, and to a certain extent, they can alter their physiology, right? And so we think about the ways animals adapt to warmer or colder temperatures. Some of that is by adjusting physiology. So this all falls under this idea of adaptive capacity. And that part of adaptive capacity is not in that future modeling that we did, that future modeling exercise. It also is based on really broad environmental data. And for something like a pygmy rabbit that maxes out at a pound, predicting environment at many kilometers scale doesn't really match. We're doing a statewide survey in collaboration with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game and many other agencies to try and do a better job of honing in on where do they occur now, and then to use that information to model the climate at a much smaller spatial scale so we understand how are they changing their physiology, how are they able to shift their behavior now, and to use that information to project forward with more accuracy and understanding of where there might be suitable habitat for rabbits in the future.
As much as I am loath to move away from the pygmy rabbits, because indeed they are super cute, we do have another thing that we want to talk about today, and that is the moose. It's another iconic Idaho animal, and it's basically as big as a pygmy rabbit is small. They've been declining in numbers in recent years, and you set to find out why. So what did you discover? Why are these moose struggling so much?
Yeah. So I'll give a little bit of context in that, based on data that Idaho Department of Fish and Game has, based on hunter harvest data, aerial survey data, there's suggestion that moose numbers have been declining for the past couple of decades here in Idaho. But what there really was a really good population data that has monitored and documented survival of adults and reproduction across the state in a consistent fashion. And so Idaho Department of Fish and Game was really interested in getting that data to try and understand why populations might be declining. And this was a project with 2 graduate students, worked with Fish and Game, worked with the university. We worked with Washington State University as well. And we fitted about 150 adult females with radio collars, GPS radio collars, and then also a smaller number, about 17 9-month-old calves. And we monitored survival for both adults and calves. And then also for adult females, we monitored reproduction across multiple years. And we use those data to model survival, to model reproduction, and to try and get some first, early information about causes of mortality. And so, what was some of the results? I mean, adult females have pretty high survival. It was over 90% per year, which is great. Reproduction was relatively high as well. I think about 89% of females were pregnant. About 85% of those gave birth. About 14% were twins. So they were. It's not super high relative to other populations, but it's reasonable. Calf survival was a little bit different, and that we just put a few collars on calves in January. So those were ones that already lived all the way through the summer and the fall. And for those calves, about 50% of them didn't make it to their first birthday. Now that's a small sample size, but it raised some red flags. And right now, Idaho Department of Fish and Game is following up with a study to get much better information about calf survival and causes of mortality. Some of the things that came out as far as causes of mortality for both adults and the calves, they have many different parasites. It's sort of a rough life if you're a moose. One that's probably affecting survival of both adults and calves is the winter tick. And the winter tick is a little bit unique from other ticks, a little bit different in that it's a single host tick. So these ticks glom onto large mammal, moose, and other large mammals in the fall. They stay on, they take blood meals, they stay on, they go through multiple life cycles on the moose over the winter. They mate, males and females find each other, they mate on the moose, and then the gravid females, the ones that have eggs, take many more blood meals as they get big and they blow up to about the size of a grape, and then fall off. It's disgusting. Fall off in the spring, and the females really can't move around. So kind of wherever they land, they lay eggs in the soil. Those eggs stay quiescent and then hatch into larvae right there in the same place. And in the fall, they crawl up vegetation, grass stems, the larva, and wait to hook onto a moose or another large mammal. They go through this life cycle on the moose. They take many blood meals, and so places where these ticks are at very high density, some of the places in the Northeast United States, I mean, they have moose that die from exsanguination, just from losing blood. And even if they don't drink them dry, they wind up causing a pretty high energetic cost because moose are constantly replacing this blood. They also, if they have these high infestations, wind up rubbing and scratching and breaking off their guard hairs so that they have less insulation in the winter, which means they burn more energy staying warm. So there's lots of different ways that these winter ticks can affect moose. They seem to affect adults by energetically draining them, but it seems they have a bigger, potentially a larger effect on the young ones, which may be part of why those calves collared in January, many of them didn't survive all the way to their first birthday. That late winter period is a sort of nutritionally stressed period, and if they're losing a lot of blood to ticks, it can really just tip them over the edge.
If these moose are dying, or at least some of them are dying because of blood loss, how many ticks are we talking about?
Well, I mean, hundreds of thousands for some of them, but tens of thousands. I know. Don't Google it. It's an image you can't unsee. If you Google it and you look at that, it's just not an image you can unsee. Yeah.
That's absolutely terrible.
Yeah. We had some two undergrads here who are working on projects to try and better understand the ticks and the tick life cycle. And there's here on campus, Kenyon Oyen is a tick researcher with the USDA, and she's also working with a student to try and better understand the life cycle of these ticks and what it is that affects them, because they are influenced by weather, particularly when they're off the moose and in the ground.
Do you have any idea if there's anything that can be done to help these moose who are just getting, absolutely devoured by ticks?
Yeah, it's a really challenging question. There is some work that has been exploring naturally occurring funguses that sort of can inhibit the ticks, but not a lot. There's not a lot of what do we do about it. There's also the potential to burn areas and kill the ticks that are in the ground, but you're probably not able to burn such a large area. One of the students here looked at space use and habitat use for moose, and because these ticks are dropping off in the spring, we looked at what types of habitats are moose using during the spring and what types of habitats are they using during the fall. And one of the things we find is that where there's a lot of overlap between spring and fall habitats, those moose tend to have higher tick loads. So, we're starting to get a better understanding of how they transmit it, but what to do about it is really challenging, especially because some information suggests that warmer temperatures are sort of tip the balance in favor of ticks. They have higher survival, higher abundance of ticks.
Do they just go after large mammals? Is this mostly a moose thing or elk thing? Are they attracted to humans at all?
They aren't going to get on you, so you're good there. At least they aren't going to do much if they get on you. They do get on other large mammals, so they'll be on elk, they'll be on deer, even occasionally bighorn sheep, they found them. They don't seem to have the same negative effects and get to the same densities on these other animals as they do on moose, which is a question why. I think it's a really interesting question why, and some people hypothesize that moose are not as good at grooming them off. I don't know if that's the case, but it is curious that they definitely have a very tight association with ticks. It may have to do with the fact that, evolutionarily, moose are just not as well equipped to deal with winter ticks, and it may be that over the longer period of time, over an evolutionary period of time, they haven't been exposed to winter ticks as long as other species like deer and elk that have evolved ways to deal with it.
Well, I've never been so happy not to be a moose.
Right. And the ticks aren't the only the parasite. There's another one it's called an arterial worm, or Eleophora. And these are worms that maybe get 4.5 inches long that are in the bloodstream of moose. Actually, some work we did with another student and collaborators at Washington State University. These worms cause problems because they block blood flow to the head. And so sometimes you see moose that have ears that have kind of rotted off because the blood hasn't gotten there. Or sometimes they will find moose sort of moving and acting in an abnormal manner before they die. And they find that they're full of these arterial worms. But some of the work we did with the pathologists Kyle Taylor and others at Washington State University, we looked at the brains of these moose. Adult worms are one thing, but they also have a very small microscopic stage that are called microfilaria, and they get throughout the bloodstream. And when they're in the blood, they can congregate in places like the kidney and cause kidney damage, or in the brain and cause essentially little tiny strokes throughout the brain. And so from moose that we were studying here in Idaho that died, we took samples to the Washington Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab, and they examined these brains. And for moose, it was more prevalent in southern Idaho than northern Idaho, but about half of the ones we looked at in southern Idaho that died had these microfilaria and brain damage as a result of it. That parasite is transmitted from moose to moose through a type of like a horsefly or a deer fly. They bite an infected moose and then bite another one and transmit that. So that's another challenge that also is potentially going to get worse with climate change and moose. Yeah. Now you're really glad not to be a moose, right?
Yeah, it gives me a whole new perspective on them, that's for sure. So if you could give our listeners just one big takeaway about your research, what would that be?
I think that when we think about managing wildlife populations, there's a lot more than just populations that are harvested or not harvested, managing harvest levels, understanding animal health, understanding what components of the habitat are really important for their survival and their persistence. That kind of information allows managers to make decisions about how to keep species that we want to keep around on the landscape. Some of the answers aren't easy. The moose answers are not going to be easy. The pygmy rabbit ones, maybe not easy either, although we have a better idea on how far they move, what type of habitat they need, and land managers can then use that information to make decisions about, for example, they've used some of our work to make decisions about where to put fire breaks or where to put roads in sagebrush habitat. One of the really cool things about working at a university and working in a department that does sort of a combination of basic and applied research is that we get to learn really cool stuff, but we also get to use that information, for the good of the species and the people that live in these environments.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I thoroughly loved learning all about pygmy rabbits and moose. And like I said, I have a whole new perspective on moose.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed talking. Thanks so much.
So, Lee, did learning about all of that make you feel any better?
I mean, I enjoy having answers, but my gosh, the poor moose. So, I'll be honest, I actually knew a decent amount about the pygmy rabbits because I did a story on them, and they are as cute as they sound. But I didn't actually know about the moose as much. What's always shocking to me is when, it's not like moose are a new animal. We suddenly discovered them. We didn't know about them. They're an animal that scientists have studied. They're an animal that, we have whole hunting seasons around moose, so we have to know their numbers and everything, and yet there's some basic things that affect them that we don't have answers to. I mean, it sounds like, Janet's getting there and getting some answers for us, but she had to ask these questions. Part of me is always shocked when that happens, that we don't know these things, but it's also, to me, super exciting that there's always these questions out there that need to be answered and need to be explored.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Some parts of my life, I don't like having open-ended questions. But yeah, it's nice that there's still some mysteries out there in the world. And I do want to apologize. As you heard, Janet actually said, do not Google this. And I'm sorry.
I'm holding it against you.
Honestly, you should. But I will say, if you have not yet, if you've listened to this whole podcast, and you have not yet Googled pygmy rabbits, you absolutely need to do that.
So true. So true. They are adorable.
Thank you for listening to the Vandal Theory. You can visit our website, uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory, to learn more about our research. Email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu. We are on all of the podcast platforms, and we'd love it if you rated and reviewed and subscribed. I'm Danae Lenz.
And I'm Lee Cooper.
Thanks for joining us.